Stakeholder.
In gambling, an independent party with whom each of those who make a wager deposits the money or counters wager.
A person with an interest or concern in something, especially a business.
In emergency management, any person or entity with a vested interest in the survival and recovery of a given community. You.
Welcome to Stakeholder Prepping.
Welcome back to Stakeholder Prepping, where you, yes, you, are the stakeholder in your own survival. We are your hosts. My name is Chris.
And I'm AC.
And AC, before we jump into today's episode, I know when this episode releases, it's December 8th, which means if you are listening, you have 12 days or less to get your free tickets to Homestead. And all you have to do is send in something that shows you are sharing the podcast. Send in a screenshot or, tag Stakeholder Prep in your share on Twitter. But send us an email to stakeholderprepping@gmail.com. We will send you a code for 2 completely free tickets to the new movie Homestead, which releases on December 20th. And it is promising to be a true preppers movie.
Yeah, it looks really cool. It does. It looks like an honest God, true preppers movie. And like you said, you've read the books. I haven't read the books, but it does look like a really cool movie. And what's the guy's name? Is it Neil McDonough is the main character?
Yep.
Or one of them? I just liked him from like Band of Brothers. Like he's been in a lot of really good stuff.
Lieutenant Bill Compton.
Lieutenant Compton. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, AC, what are we talking about today?
It was Buck Compton. Shit, I couldn't let that one go. It was Buck Compton.
Buck Compton, yes.
It was Buck Compton. Buck Compton. He's a real person. Anyway.
Not Bill. You're right. It was Bill Garnier, his friend that got torn up.
Old Garnier.
That's why he was removed
That's
from
right.
the battlefield. Already, we're going on with the corrections. So this is going to be a spicy episode. What are we doing today, AC?
Okay, so today we are going to talk about some big government stuff and then talk about how that relates sort of to your daily life, or how you can relate that to your daily life and to your journey through preparedness in general. We got a lot of really good feedback about episode 3, which is where we kind of talked about some of the big government theory and the big government preparedness thing. And so we're going to kind of go down that path again, and then we're going to bring this back to how this truly can help you in your daily life and in your sort of preparedness mindset. So we're going to start with some of that theory, and then Chris, I'm sure you'll have a lot of commentary to jump in on, but we'll get a lot more granular and kind of discuss how this can actually be applicable and helpful in just your day-to-day business. So let's start big and kind of talk about some big government programs that I have personally worked on and around for years. And
All right.
to do that, we kind of have to go pre 9/11. It's kind of funny. We always, it's like, the U.S. government and the DOD, there's this pre 9/11 world and this post 9/11 world. You always have to go back to pre 9/11 because that's really when a lot of stuff changed,
It's a huge benchmark in American history.
It really is.
For sure.
From everything from like asymmetrical warfare and just how the structure of the government, 9/11 really changed a lot of that stuff. So we have to go back pre 9/11 and particularly in my world, it's pre-March 2003, because that's when DHS shows up and the Coast Guard moves under DHS and all that cool stuff started to happen. So before Coast Guard went under DHS, each individual Coast Guard station had this like incredibly long leash. Essentially, they could purchase a lot of equipment and assets that each individual station or sector wanted. And they didn't really have any standardization across the fleet as far as their boat classes. In 2003, that all really started to change with this delivery of a new class of vessel that was deployed throughout the fleet. It was called the RBS Defender, and that stands for Response Boat Small. So all of the Coast Guard boat classes have these cool acronyms, but the RBS contract was really one of the first large standard equipment buys for the U.S. Coast Guard. The IDIQ, which stands for Indefinite Delivery, Indefinite Quantity. So that was the original contract, meaning that they didn't have to exercise all of them, but that's how many they planned to buy. So the original IDIQ was 700. And I think out of that, they exercised about 445 of those. So they actually fielded 445 of those RBS, those 25-foot response boats, fielded those to the fleet. And then they followed that on in 2011 with the RBS-2 contract. And that was about 375 boats, I think. Those were a little bigger. When they replaced them, and they replaced them with a 29-foot boat for a little more capability. They had a lot of stuff they wanted to do. They wanted to be able to fit inside a C-130. There was all kinds of stuff like that. But in total, they bought a little over 900 of these things, and they were very expensive boats. And these delivered to the Coast Guard to replace their hodgepodge of shore-based response boats. So until 2003, if you were in the Coast Guard and you moved around from station to station, you would likely be operating on a completely different vessel with completely different characteristics and even different navigation and safety equipment.
So let me just make sure I've got this correct here. So pre-2003, so 9/11 included, the Coast Guard, they can buy just about whatever they want. Then in 2003, they move under Department of Homeland Security. And now we're trying to standardize all of their equipment. So one Coast Guard sailor goes from Alaska to Miami to San Diego, and they don't have to completely retrain on all of the equipment.
Yeah, that's right. So if you were a coxswain on an RBS platform, then you could go from, station Miami to station San Diego, and the boat operated completely. It was the same boat, and they didn't have that really before 2003, before this giant RBS buy where they put 550 of the exact same boats in the fleet. Now, obviously, they have a bunch of different boat classes, but that was the one. That was the workhorse. That's when you call Mayday on the radio and you're within a few miles of shore. That's who shows up, is this 25-foot safe boat. And then now it's the 29-foot replacement to that. But obviously, training would take a significant amount of time when you were doing that. Like you said, hopping around from station to station. And along with fleet standardization, they also needed to standardize their navigation electronics, like the radars and the sonar equipment, night vision equipment, all of that stuff. So that original contract that I worked on quite a bit was called the SINS program, which there's just cool acronyms. We need to do an entire episode on acronyms, but it's SINS. It's the Scalable Integrated Navigation System. And they followed that up with the complete redesign to their entire navigation suite and SAR capabilities in 2017 with the SINS 2 program. So all kinds of really cool stuff. This program kind of revolutionized the way the Coast Guard could effect a rescue by, leaning on their navigation equipment to plot search and rescue patterns. They literally used to, and you'll enjoy this, the old school way to do this was you had a grease pencil and you drew it on the window. You would draw your SAR pattern on the window. So you would drop datum, they call it. Basically, you'd like throw a life jacket in the water and you'd watch it float, and you'd keep a stopwatch and you go, okay, this is what the current is doing. And then you do some math and you plot out this search and rescue pattern, because ideally it's this perfect expanding square, but in real life it's not, because the current, and you have to account for the way the current moves. Now that's all done on the nav electronics. You literally push a button and it senses the movement of the boat using GPS. It tells you how much you've moved over time. You plot a pattern and it plots it on the map, and you just hit go. So it just really, this SINS program kind of just revolutionized the way they could operate their electronics, and it allowed them to better interoperate with their other port partners, because now all these other agencies are using the exact same electronics. They're all on the same page. So this thing really got bigger than the Coast Guard.
And so I'm sure it probably reduced rescue time for several people who ended up having to call Mayday.
Saving time saves lives. Absolutely. It cuts down on all of the time it takes you to effect a rescue, and that ultimately does save lives. You're exactly right. So, not only did it make them far more efficient and effective, it also reduced the crew training by orders of magnitude. So now, like we talked about, anybody qualified on a particular boat class could move from station to station and from sector to sector with minimal training needed to operate in this new area. So the amount of money and time and effort this saved the Coast Guard really was immeasurable. And I was actually sitting in a brief just last week with the Coast Guard discussing the next iteration of this program. So be called the SINS 3 contract. And we're discussing ways that they can kind of leverage technology and standardize the fleet even more than it already is, right? So, they want to be able to focus on things like cybersecurity and anti-GPS spoofing and jamming and all these other things that are starting to impact their world. Now, the other takeaway here, besides just the obvious reduction in training costs and the safety aspect of standardization, is to pay attention to how the Coast Guard went really hard one way, trying to buy 700 of this exact same tool, right? The exact same boat class, basically shoving way too many missions into one platform. And then they scaled it back and eventually ended up with only about half as many of that boat class 14 years later.
Okay. That makes sense. And we're definitely going to touch on that in a little bit. You can over standardize yourself and really have to dial it back. But I don't know about you, AC. I'm not, I don't have that fuck around and find out money. Between me and my wife, we just don't have it. We don't have that kind of R&D budget to completely buy all new equipment every year, test it out, figure out what works for us and what doesn't, what's scalable and what's not. Like, we do not have our own DARPA like the US government does.
Yeah.
And I've got at least one friend who does work for DARPA. Can't really discuss anything that they're working on right now, but the government has, if they really want to, they've got almost unlimited funds for trial and error, but the vast majority of preppers just don't. I mean, if Elon Musk is listening and he's a prepper, he's kind of in his own class. The rest of us are down actually working jobs, and we just don't have the kind of resource allocation that we can provide to that. So we have to be a little bit smarter with money and preps and training and focus on what we feel is important. And this goes back to our episode on building your own risk matrix.
Sure.
You can buy all sorts of hurricane survival gear, but if you live in the middle of South Dakota, what are the odds of you needing hurricane survival equipment?
Right. Yeah, you need to plan for what you're most likely to encounter. And then kind of plan all the way for that and then move up your risk matrix, right? So you're right. The government doesn't really have to do that kind of stuff. They kind of do have unlimited funds to say, well, let's try this and see what happens. And then if that wasn't the right thing to do, they can go take more of your tax dollars and spend it somewhere else. So yeah, you're right. We don't have the ability to do that. So it's an excellent point. I think we are going to circle back to that. So, that's kind of the Coast Guard, and they're pretty good when it comes to standardization, at least from my world, from my perspective, working around them. That they are very good at it. Now, the Department of Defense, they're a bit further behind the Coast Guard in terms of standardization, at least in the Navy world, in the area of the DoD that I really get to see what's going on. They are a lot further behind.
Well, yes, because they can't figure out what uniform they want to go with.
Yeah, you do got to change the uniform up. We should actually. I do want to talk. We should do an episode on all the different camo patterns and like pixel camo and the digital camo and how that helps with EOIR sensors and things like that. There is some really cool stuff when you talk about changing uniforms up. But you're right. Yeah, DoD does. They move things around quite a bit, and then the Navy obviously they have their own issues. But I was recently in a brief with the Navy, and they talked about the interest in moving away from the traditional outboard engine and all their fleet of small boats, as the outboard engine is the thing in the entire United States Navy that takes unleaded gas. The Navy really doesn't operate on unleaded gas. In fact, really none of the military does, with the exception of outboard engines operated by the Navy. So
Interesting.
from a bunkering perspective, and this is when you're refueling smaller vessels from bigger vessels. From a bunkering perspective, it's one of the most unsafe things they're currently doing with fuel. So you've got all of these little black inflatable boats that the Navy SEALs run along with a ton of other special forces groups. And I don't know if you've ever got to run in one of these, Chris. I have, but it's pretty much in every movie and every TV show where they're showing Navy SEALs run into the beach in this little rubber raft. It's inevitably a Zodiac 470. They have countless amount of these little vessels, and they're running usually a 50 horse outboard engine. I want to say that 470 is rated to a 65 horsepower, but they're running these 50 horse. And it's crazy because that motor alone, that might be a $12,000 to $15,000 motor. And now the newer ones, the Raiders they're running, which are a lot better for standardization, those might be like a $19,000 motor. And then that, just the rubber raft itself, I'm calling it a rubber raft, but they're not. They're rigid hull inflatables. They're awesome boats, but they're just they're called a 470 because they're 4.7 meters. They're not very big. They're like 15 and a half feet long. And that boat might be, 15 or $20,000. So it's a big chunk of money here. Right now, the way that thing sits kitted out for the SEALs, that might be like a $45,000 little 15-foot inflatable vessel with an outboard on it. So
A little bit more than your nice bass boat, but you can definitely get a bass boat more expensive than a rig.
right. But it's crazy to think about just this little outboard rubber raft they're running. And I have a really good friend who's an operator with a certain spec ops group, who shall remain nameless, but he told me that depending on how they're going to transport these little 470s back after a mission or even a training, they may just throw the engine into the ocean or sink the entire boat simply because the fumes from an unleaded outboard can be problematic inside an aircraft. Think about it. You're in a pressurized aircraft where you're recirculating air and things like that. The Navy also operates a ton of these little, what they call port security boats or force protection boats. These are generally, I think the small ones are maybe 29 feet. The large ones are probably 45 or 50 feet. And again, they're running outboard engines. They're the only vessels in the entire United States Navy, the only engine in the entire United States Navy that is running unleaded gasoline. So besides that little boat, everything else in the Navy is running JP5, JP8, bunker oil, HFO, heavy fuel oil, I think is what it is, HFO. All of these are not explosive unless you really, really try hard. So they don't have commonality across these platforms. So they have to carry an entire other ship with them loaded with unleaded gas just so they can bunker these smaller vessels. And that bunkering process of offloading unleaded gas onto another vessel, it can be really dangerous. So they're looking for alternatives like new diesel outboards. And unfortunately, the tech, it really isn't there yet. They're heavy, they're expensive, and there's two really big brands that are doing it, and they still have some kind of quality issues. But the Navy is moving along. They're running these new Raider engines, which are multi-fuel engines, which is crazy. They're an outboard engine that can run both unleaded gas and diesel through like a traditional carbureted engine. I don't know exactly how they do it. It sounds like magic to me.
Pretty wild.
It's pretty crazy. They basically and yeah, it's wild to look up these guys. But if you look up Raider engines, these things, they can be submerged 65 feet, this outboard engine, and then they just come up to the surface and run. So they can deploy these things now out of submarines, which is crazy. Like, so this Zodiac 470 rolled up with, deflated with an outboard engine can be pushed out of a submarine 65 feet underwater, float to the top, and they can start the engine, which is just crazy. And it can run multi-fuel. So they're getting, so why this story? Well, because we want to stress how important it can be for you to just start thinking this way, to start thinking about having common platforms and common equipment in your own daily life. And we don't need to talk about, the way the military does things all the time, but I'm sure Chris can tell us about the weapons and the equipment in his particular unit and how they've kept pretty common platforms from like weapons and ammo to all the other gear, just because this is common sense, right?
Yeah, and this is something that without even realizing it, you probably do on a daily basis. So when we're talking about standardization, if you go into your closet, you probably have everything laid out with, you might be a bi-color person, or you might be a bi-weather pattern person. So your long sleeves are all on the right-hand side of your closet. All your short sleeve stuff is on the left-hand side. You might have pants separate from shorts and things like that. That is all standardization. And once you get used to that, it makes things a lot easier to live. Another example would be you move into a new house with your significant other. Who gets the left side of the bed? Who gets the right? That's a standardization. And it's
Sure.
that simple to kind of sort out in your daily life, but you
Mhm.
don't even think about it. So you pick a route to work. That becomes your standardized route. If something goes wrong on that route, you still have a little bit of adaptability. You can find an alternate or a contingency or an emergency route, but you have your standard route. And so there's a lot that goes into kind of large scale standardization. So NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, we're all familiar with NATO and everything that they do. They have a standardization of munitions, including 9mm, 5.56 by 45, 7.62 by 51, even the 50 BMG caliber. It allows for nations under the alliance to operate small arms interchangeably. So if one NATO nation has another NATO nation's troops next to them on the battlefield and one side runs out of ammo, they can very quickly and easily transfer ammunition, and they don't have to worry about it not fitting the caliber, right? Back in the really since the 40s, the Russians have always built their artillery and mortar pieces 1 millimeter larger than anything NATO. So we have an 80 millimeter mortar system. They have an 81 or an 82. I think ours is 81 and theirs is 82. We have 120. Theirs is 121. Same on their main gun for their T90s. It's a 121 millimeter tube versus our 120. And the theory is, I've never gotten confirmation on this, so maybe somebody out there can kind of correct me on this.
Sure.
But I've always understood the theory behind that is in an emergency, they could pick up and use our large scale munitions because it would fit loosely down the barrel. So they wouldn't get as accurate of a shot. They could still use it. Versus if we tried to use theirs, it won't even chamber. It won't go down the tube.
Oh, wow. That's like the most Russian thing I've ever heard, but that's awesome.
Right? Especially if you do have any sort of manufacturing or supply chain defects or anything like that, you basically doubled your entire stash of medium arms and tank shells on the battlefield. But even the M249 squad automatic weapon, the SAW, this is the one that you see in a lot of movies. It's the belt-fed, shoulder-fired machine gun. It's the air-cooled version. You see it in Black Hawk Down. You even see it in the Winter Soldier. The MCU one, where they're going into the bunker and Bucky has his SAW with a 60-round M4 magazine in it. And the SAW is designed to accept M4 and 16 magazines if belts are unavailable. And it does work that way. But really, standardization of equipment across all military branches, it includes the transition from Alice gear to Molly gear. And this happened roughly, it's definitely a global war on terror transition, but it happened roughly 2005 to 2008. You started seeing units trade out their old Alice clip gear for the new Molly design, which is what you see traditionally. If you go and look up MOLLE attachments, they're 1-inch loops that are fitted in. Those are when you see somebody on TV and they're in their bulletproof vest, and they're in the military. Those loops on there, that's what Molly is. Everything from night vision mounting brackets, those are all going to be the same across the branches. Your advanced combat helmet design, that's standardized. There's a lot of aspects to this that continue to develop as operators continue to provide feedback, and not just
Sure.
operators, but the lowly little troops on the ground like I was. Um, I was in a normal infantry unit, and then I switched to a normal satellite control unit. Without going into too much detail, that's basically what I had, but I had the same kind of level of gear as far as body armor, as far as helmet, night vision attachments, things like that between
Mm-hmm.
both units. And they get a lot of feedback from the SOCOM teams, the special operations community, um, because they are constantly deployed. If you know a soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, Coast Guardsman, whoever, if they've been on a 12-month, 14-month, 18-month deployment, if they've even been on 2 or 3, those special forces teams, they're going on 2 or 3 deployments to different countries in that same amount of time. They're a lot shorter deployments in general, but they go a lot more places and tend to do a lot more things.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a clothing company. Have you heard of Patagonia clothes?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Come on, man. Pacific Northwest. Yeah, like I've got Patagonia underwear on right now. Sure.
Yep. So
Yeah.
Patagonia has designed and developed their entire clothing line, and they hand it off to special forces teams to test. Did you know
Interesting.
that?
No. I thought it was total like hippie granola wear. I had no idea.
No, their entire motto throughout all of this is if special forces can't break it, nobody can. So
Wow.
they function and form test
Mm-hmm.
everything by testing it with special forces teams, whether it's jungle, urban warfare, winter, and Arctic warfare, things like that. So there's a reason that Patagonia is expensive, but they get with those SFODA teams directly to give feedback so they can continually improve their designs. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize. You're getting what you pay for.
I had no idea. That's really interesting. So now, okay, we talked about like the ammunition, but let's talk about guns for a minute. So hopefully everybody listening, and I know this isn't actually the case, but ideally everybody has broken down an AR-15 by now. Ideally, everybody's tried to build one from a finished lower receiver. And you kind of know how fairly, I'm using, air quotes, but how fairly easy they are to service. There's a reason that they are the most popular rifle in America. But if everyone in your group is using the same rifle, then you only need to stock parts for one rifle. And this also means that, one, you're buying a whole lot less parts, but two, if you do have a rifle that goes down, you only have to salvage one rifle so that many others may live.
That's very true. And we don't completely want to let this go into a gun episode, but I
Right.
think this is an important one because you're right. The AR-15 is incredibly easy to use. It is ergonomic. It is light recoil. It is very modular. You can design it for special applications. You can change caliber. You can change rifling patterns. You can do all sorts of things with an AR-15 while your core set of functional operating pieces remains the same. So if you change, for example, from 5.56 barrel to a 300 blackout round, you don't have to change the bolt face, any of that. It uses all standardized components there. It's just the barrel and the gas block that you're potentially changing out. But without going into too much detail on that, the AR-15 is almost unquestionably the most widely replicated firearm in the US, but not necessarily the world. So that title is going to fall somewhere between the FAL/L1A1 battle rifle and the AK-47 variants. And there are almost 100 different AK-47 variants.
Right.
You've got the AKM, the AKMS, the AKS, it goes on and on and on. But they're available in more countries around the globe than any other platforms. The difficulty with this is that not all of those variants of those weapon platforms are easily transferable, even between each other. And it can come down to the difference between the inch pattern versus the metric pattern for L1, A1, and FAL rifles. So one of them is metric, one of them is an inch pattern, and if you get the wrong locking shoulder, now you have basically a bolt action gun if you can get it to go into battery. You could have an AK that is stamped versus milled. It could be Yugoslavian pattern versus the more widely used Russian, which is the Romanian, Egyptian, Polish, East German, all of those other countries out there. They tend to go with a Russian pattern, whereas the Yugoslavians went with their completely own pattern. And then you get Czech with their VZ series. They took the AK and made it their own, and almost none of those pieces or parts are interoperable. But without the parts interoperability aspect, support for soldiers on the front line can be very difficult to achieve. So you get this result of battlefield improvisation in order to accomplish the mission. That's where you get battlefield pickup rifles. That's where you get trying to run a 120 millimeter mortar through a 121 millimeter system. It will work in an emergency, but is it truly effective? And as an example, like we're seeing with the conflict in Ukraine, a battlefield pickup rifle, it may not be able to be sacrificed to give life to other weapons, even if it has given up the ghost itself. You might only be able to use the ammo if you strip it out of the magazines.
So you have settled the AR-15 to AK-47 debate for me once and for all. I mean, that's it for me. If you literally can't use parts from one to necessarily fix another rifle, then what's the point of owning a whole bunch of AKs? You might as well just own a whole bunch of different rifles, one for each particular mission subset, rather than the AR-15 or M4 platform that, can do a whole lot of stuff. It doesn't do 100% of the job, but you really did just settle the argument for me.
I will say the Russians are very, very good at designing weapons that are purpose-built and focused. So if you look at something like the VSS Ventores, it is a 9x39 subsonic munition fired out of an AK-style platform with a completely integrated suppressor on the barrel. They are stupidly quiet. But the ammunition is hard to find, hard to manufacture effectively, and once you get outside of a certain range, it drops off and it's useless. So you cut your range basically in half compared to a 7.62x39. And if you're on a Spetsnaz or a group team or something like that, Alpha Group or anything along those lines, you might have a Ventores. But if you're just a regular Joe Schmo and you try to load up your 7.62, you're not going to have a good day.
Right. So I mean that is really interesting. They build these platforms that are specific for one little tiny mission, and then it's sort of then it's not the right tool for almost every mission. It's the perfect tool for one exact specific mission. So let's pivot from guns, and let me tell you a story. So I travel a ton, right? Like a ton, and I'm renting cars pretty often. And it's to the point now that I've got all the status in the world, all the status you could ever have. And with all the rental car agencies, I usually just kind of go and pick whatever car I want on the lot. They just say, pick something out of this row. Now, my daily drivers are a couple of Chevys. I don't really buy into the whole Ford versus Chevy thing. I have both. The truth is, when I bought my new truck, Ford just didn't have the exact class of truck I was looking for. But I also have a Chevy SUV, and that's a lease vehicle they gave me for work, so I didn't really get to choose that car. But they're both pretty new, so a lot of the buttons are the same. So now, when I rent a car, I can walk down the aisle, and I can get in whatever I want. And sometimes there are some pretty fun, fancy cars, maybe a lot of cool little cars I might want to drive. But usually, I just grabbed the Chevy Malibu. And I don't particularly like the Malibu. I mean, it's just a car, but I know exactly how to operate it. The second I get in the car, I know how to pair my phone. I know how to operate the nav, everything else about the car. There's zero learning curve.
Okay.
So
I getcha.
get it? So this is an interoperability story, but it's also kind of a safety thing. I don't need to learn anything about this car to be 99% proficient in it. Now, I'm not going to lie. I did grab a Mercedes C300 a couple of weeks ago just because it was sitting in the aisle, but usually I just, it's just your standard rental cars. And I kind of grabbed the one I'm already trained in, right? I grabbed the vehicle that I am already 100% proficient in. Now let's equate that to our daily lives a little bit. And we get super granular and very specific here. But, let's just pick a couple of examples just so you start thinking this way. I'm a dual tool guy.
Same here. I
yeah.
love my DeWalt's.
I do. And I had all of their 18-volt gear, all their tools. And a couple of years ago, I bit the bullet and I upgraded to the 20-volt lithium line. And I think I bought the whole kit. Maybe it was 8 tools and a couple extra batteries, and they're common across all these platforms, right? I did buy a couple larger capacity batteries because I might need them for certain jobs, but those batteries do all fit in all the same tools. And I also kept the old tools. And, some shady non-DeWalt sanctioned dude on eBay sells a little adapter that makes my new 20-volt batteries work with my 18-volt tools.
I think I have one or two of those converters. Yeah.
Yeah. The lithium or the old Nikon batteries, they're kind of like a long skinny thing that it went up into the tool. And now the lithium one's going to slide on. So it's just this little adapter. And there's got to be some kind of capacitor in there that takes it from 20 volts to 18 volts so they don't catch fire. Or maybe there isn't. I don't know. But but that thing was like $20. And so for the price of this $20 converter, I have an entire set of backup tools. Now, maybe you like DeWalt, but maybe Makita has a better right angle drill. So you just have to have one of those. And maybe the Craftsman circular saw is nicer because the motor's on the other side, so it allows you to eyeball cleaner cuts. I don't know. But now you have 3 tools with 3 different batteries, and more importantly, 3 different battery chargers. And although they don't cost any more money now, imagine in an SHTF event, or even not an SHTF event, when one of those 3 dissimilar batteries or dissimilar battery chargers takes a shit. If all of one tool platform does 90% of the job, then this is the prepper way. And obviously, if you're a professional, right? If you're a carpenter, if you're using these tools every day, I get why you would have specialty tools. That makes sense. You are the Russian sniper in this particular scenario. But if you're
Die, comrade.
yeah, but if you're like me, yeah, well, in Russia, we use polar bear for skill saw. But if you're like me, this is the way you should be thinking. I have another example of tools, and this is kind of the big stuff, like the weed whackers, the mowers, chainsaws, things like that. And you're going to make fun of me because I am transitioning into battery operated tools. I have all, gas engine tools, and we talked about that last episode where I stock avgas for them and they all run forever, but they may not run forever, and I may run out of gas eventually. Now, there's a company called Greenworks. I really like them. They have an 80-volt tool line, and I've been slowly buying those and moving away from a lot of my gas equipment. One, I can recharge the batteries off solar if there's no gas, so it's kind of like free energy. And 2, I'm using all common equipment with the same battery. So they even make like an e-bike. So think about this in SHTF. Now I've got 15 of these stupid batteries because I'm trying to run a mower on them. But now I have an e-bike, and it's not one of those e-bikes where you plug it in and eventually the battery stops working and then you've got a useless bike. This is that same 80-volt tool battery that comes out of my tools, and I just plop it into this pedal-assisted mountain bike. So I could carry 2 more of these things in my backpack on my back, these 80-volt batteries, and swap them out and triple the range of, your traditional e-bike. So they even sell Greenworks has this little it's a 120 volt adapter for their battery. So you plug this big 80-volt battery in, and it's got a couple of USB ports and a 120 AC wall wart. So I could plug in my refrigerator into this little 80-volt battery now. So for like $120, I bought this thing that now I can run all of my appliances using these 80-volt batteries I was already going to own for other things. So does that get you thinking that way, Chris, where now this is why sort of standardization and having this commonality across equipment, it's just good to think this way?
It absolutely is, and I'm along the same page. While all of this is well and good, I want to bring up a very important counterpoint to all of this. So you can over standardize your loadout, and because of that over standardization, you can lose adaptability and improvisation, which are crucial in that SHTF world. So you talked at this about the very beginning about how the Coast Guard started with 700 of the same platform for the mission, but then they dialed it back by almost half because they were putting too much stock in one particular craft, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, they said, you know what, we thought we could do this mission with 700 of this 25-foot boat, and then they decided, oh, you know what, some of those stations, rather than having 3 RBSs, they needed 2 RBSs and an LRI, which is a long-range interceptor platform, or they needed an RBM, which is a response boat medium. It was a 45-foot boat, so it was just a little more capable in heavy seas. So you're exactly right. Over standardization can be the death of you as well.
Yeah, and this is especially important when you're considering other members of your group. Now, hopefully, this episode will get this conversation kind of flowing in your group if you have one. If not, this is a perfect starter to kind of work your way into or build a group from the ground up. Let's say you have a lifetime supply of 45 ACP ammunition, right?
Check, I'm there. Got it.
You've got all the 1911s you could possibly imagine, unlimited magazines, all the tactical gear to go with it that you can possibly get your grumpy little paws on. But if not everyone in your group can handle the recoil or simply cannot grip the gun correctly because of their hand size, you just severely limited your options for defense inside of your own group. You cut your response effectiveness by orders and orders of magnitude. And this also applies to things like clothing. Different brands may not fit the same or be comfortable to everyone, you know? Not everyone is going to like the fit of American Eagle jeans as opposed to Victos pants, or they're not going to like 511 pants and how they fit compared to, you know, regular sweatpants or surplus military tops versus your Patagonia jacket. All of this is unbelievably important when it comes to things like safety, hygiene, and other things. Think about feminine hygiene products. And I know our core audience, I know our core audience is not going to like this because our core audience is male, 18 to 49, does not have a care in the world about feminine hygiene products. But for those listeners that do, one size does not fit all. And having options available is going to increase your odds of overcoming any sort of new challenge. It's going to keep your group supported, and it's going to increase overall health, welfare, morale. You don't have to scramble for new resources, and it doesn't necessarily come down to brand in terms of feminine hygiene products, but it can come down to size options, flow options. There's an industry built around feminine hygiene products for a reason, and it's because not all people are built the same. So you have to consider all of that, especially when you're prepping. Do you have somebody who is pregnant in your group that all of a sudden you have to accommodate for extra caloric intake on a daily basis versus all men, right?
Sure. Okay. Well, let's talk about guns some more because I don't like talking about feminine hygiene products. But you did actually make me think about when you were talking about the 45 earlier and people not being able to handle recoil. It's funny. I was sitting in a law enforcement training course. And we were doing a case study on the FBI. And I don't know if you knew this, Chris. You're in the gun world. You may have already known this, but basically in the mid 80s, the FBI got into a shootout and they were a little outgunned. And they did this typical government thing of going hard one way. And what they did is they issued 10 millimeter to everybody. And 10 millimeter was new. I think that round came out in like 83. And they basically gave that round in a kind of subpar gun. It was a Smith & Wesson 1076. And I don't know if you have a lot of experience with that, but it had some inherent issues anyway. But what happened was a lot of agents, maybe some of the smaller framed agents, female agents, agents that were financial crimes agents that really never had to qualify, they couldn't qualify with a 10 millimeter because it was just a cannon of a round. And so then, classic government, they had to go hard back the other way, and they went down to 40 because 40 is basically kind of a necked down 10 millimeter. So they went back a little bit, but this is kind of big classic dumb government where they did exactly that, where they went hard one where they're like, we'll never be outgunned ever again if everybody has a 10 millimeter. But then it turns out that a ton of agents couldn't hit a paper target with a 10 millimeter because it was just too much gun for them. So you're exactly right. There are times when you can standardize, and there's times where you really shouldn't. Another time when I think you could standardize is like the over-the-counter meds. I was just thinking, like, if you've got somebody in your group that takes like Claritin, and I want Benadryl on hand because I'm allergic to bee stings. Well, I probably could get by with just Claritin. Or maybe that person who has allergies could get by with just Benadryl. And now we could stock up on one that will kind of, like I said, do 90% of that mission. Antibiotics are another one. We talk about this a little bit, but like Chris, you're allergic to certain antibiotics. So if we know that people in our group can or are allergic to, could be or are allergic to certain antibiotics, then we don't stock those ones, and we can double or triple up on all the other ones, right? So that's something good. And keep in mind, I'm going to throw the plug here to our friends at Contingency Medical. Again, we get nothing for this, but if you want to buy some antibiotics, you can use our code Stakeholder10, get $10 off. If you got any leftover HSA money, maybe. But, all of the standard over-the-counter meds, those are things that you could standardize on. If somebody says, oh, yeah, I can take aspirin, but I'm allergic to Tylenol. Okay, well, you could double up on that one. And it does, like I said, 90% of the mission for everybody in your group. Does that make sense?
It does. And that's where having that kind of understanding that if you are stocking up on one particular standardized set across everyone in your group, it may be a specific brand that you are standardizing. It may be a specific caliber. It may be a specific loadout. And that's all examples of things that you can standardize rather than just having this hodgepodge of leftover medications from the last time you went to the beach, or leftover rounds that now you have to find the gun to fit the round that you just scavenged. That's a nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to bring up a very valid perspective that you can overplan and work yourself out of a survival situation if you're too regimented in your prepping. That 90-10 rule, 90% of your time should be spent worrying about things that are almost certain to happen. Like we talked about in the blizzards episode.
Mm-hmm.
If you live in a hurricane zone, don't worry about your blizzard hitting. Worry about the hurricane. Worry about tornadoes. Focus 90% of your energy on the stuff that's almost guaranteed to happen versus the stuff that may or may not. And this is where communication, cooperation, brainstorming within your selected group, all of that comes into play. So setting up a standard layout for vehicles, like all vehicles will have an extra fuel can at the back left of the car, that's easily achievable because regardless of what car you happen to be driving, if you run out of fuel, there's a fuel can in the back left, whether it's the trunk or on the roof rack or whatever. But if you regiment too much, especially with usable or consumable products, that can lead to disaster. Just kind of something to keep in mind for your future planning sessions. Run your layout and your standardization against your risk matrix. And this is a hard one. If you can keep a tracking and a running inventory of your group's resources with this, it does take a lot to move past kind of our base instincts to let others know what we may or may not have in our supply stash, but it does go a very long way for group readiness. And that's,
Yeah.
I know you have 30 carbine because we've talked about you have 30 carbine,
Yeah, I have a lot of
but,
dirty carbon. It's true.
and I'm pretty sure you could guess I have 5.56, but we
Right.
haven't really talked about the interchangeability of our different calibers.
Right.
You have 12 gauge, 20 gauge, 308, 9
Right.
millimeter, 40 Smith and Wesson.
Well, and remember, we talked about in our weird preps episode about having things like caliber inserts, right? That's where you don't need to standardize, because rather than saying, oh, you have 9 millimeter and I have 12 gauge, I need to go buy a 9 millimeter. Well, no, really, in an emergency SHTF situation, I just need to buy this $100 caliber insert, and I can, in a shit hits the fan situation, I can fire your 9 millimeter out of my break open 12 gauge, and I didn't spend a ton of money to get there, right?
Bingo. And that's the other 10%, is that caliber insert is going to be the gap filler. So you've got everything as your primary. And then, yes, you do have one or two specialty items that become your gap filler.
Right. That's your contingency and your fallback. So let's talk about a little, I just want to bring up some of the kind of mundane things, just so people listening aren't saying, oh, well, they're just talking about this apocalyptic event where they all need to have the same guns. It's not that. I'll give you a couple of examples. So I have 2 TVs in the house. I have a sort of a TV room and then just the living room. And they're both, I bought them at the same time. They're both Samsung TVs, and they're kind of the same vintage, and they have the same remote. Well, I went to buy a smaller TV for the bedroom, and I was going to buy an LG TV because it was like $20 cheaper than the Samsung. And then I thought, well, if I have the Samsung TV in the bedroom, now all 3 of those remote controls that I have for the TV are going to work with all 3 TVs. Now, that might seem like kind of a mundane thing, but if you've ever tried to turn off a TV and you can't, it just sucks. Or tried to turn one on and you can't. So having a commonality across platforms and this commonality of equipment where I have three remote controls that operate all 3 TVs in my house, just start thinking like that.
We have had the dogs get a hold of remotes and chew them up, and had to wait for Amazon to deliver a new remote.
That would suck. Now, I've had couch cushions eat the remote, same kind of general effect. But yeah, and so even think about it from like a deep freezer standpoint. I have a couple of deep freezers, and I wish they were the same. They aren't. But let's say you have 2 or 3 deep freezers in the garage that you keep all your, all your food and your stash and your preps in, and one of those freezers dies. Now, you can't really stock an extra freezer. They take up a lot of space, and you're going to have to find space in these other freezers, or you're going to have food go bad. But if you're a mechanically inclined guy and they're all the same freezer, you could just buy one spare compressor, because that's the only part in the freezer that can go bad, is that compressor. That is what's going to fail. And they're not very big, right? They're the size of a volleyball or smaller. So you could buy that one fail part, just like we talked about for the rifles. You could buy that one fail part. Something even as silly as, say, the 1 pound to 20 pound propane tanks, right? You can get these adapter hoses that you literally can run your outdoor barbecue off that little tiny green Coleman tank. You can't run it very long because that tank will freeze up pretty quick. You need enough surface area to boil enough propane. But you could run it for some amount of time with one of these very inexpensive adapter hoses, and vice versa. Your little My Buddy space heater with an adapter hose, you could run off that giant 20-pound propane tank out of your barbecue. So
Yeah, we have a adapter hose to go to a 20-pound tank for our Pullman 3-burner camping stove.
right? Exactly. So just getting yourself to think about this, how about something as simple as if you're an electric toothbrush person and when you go to buy a new electric toothbrush, just buy the same brand of electric toothbrush for your wife or your kids. And now you only have to stock one particular brand of electric toothbrush replacement heads,
Yeah,
right?
and in that case, you can probably, I mean, if you are going to go the electric toothbrush route, you can get some of those replacement parts as off-brand. They
Sure.
don't
Yeah.
have to be, Sonicare or Oral-B brand as long as it fits. And that's where, as much as I hate to say it, that's where things like Temu and
Mm-hmm.
uh, Amazon with the off-brand Chinese, it says
Yep.
like Huidong, uh, toothbrush heads that fit this
Right.
particular model.
Exactly.
As long as it works, and that's your 10% gap filler. But the core work has already been done by standardizing. All right, everybody has this brand of toothbrush. You can have whatever heads you want, part that goes in your mouth. If you want soft heads, medium, if you want the gum massager ones, okay, get whatever you want. But if we're all interchangeable between the attachment point, and
Right.
I guess that's the part to really look at is what's going to work, what's going to fit at that attachment point, which is the critical point of failure, right?
Yep, that's exactly right. And so, we talked about how standardized certain rifles are. Exact same thing. Or like the gun caliber inserts or chamber inserts, same exact thing. Like you made an awesome point. Like, so if I know that my neighbor across the street has all 40 caliber stuff, I have no 40s. But if in an SHTF event, if I want to be able to shoot his ammunition, then yeah, I could one of two things. I can go buy a 40 and get proficient on it and have another gun, and that's expensive. Or for the 10% gap filler for $100, I can go buy a rifled chamber insert that shoots 40, and I can have that in my break open shotgun. And now, if he has an unlimited amount of this round, yeah, it's not going to be the best for me. It's a single shot break open, but I won't be defenseless.
And that's another thing that my wife and I did. We bought her to fit her hand. We got her a Glock 23, which is a
Mm-hmm.
40 caliber Glock.
Mm-hmm.
But that particular weapon is basically a Glock 19 frame, same slide, same bolt face, same everything. It's just barrel that's different and the magazines that are different. So then we got a 9mm barrel for Glock 19, and it just drop in
Right.
and changed the magazines. And she has capability to fire 40 or 9mm in the same exact platform. It's just making sure that the magazines are done correctly, which is easy enough with spray paint. Just
Right.
tag the outside of that
Right.
magazine. Orange is 40 cal, blue is 9mm, or whatever you decide to come up with. But that's that gap filler that we built into our own prep.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, Glock mags. That's another one. Glock mags. Every single thing in the world fires a Glock 17 magazine. So if you want to have a pistol caliber carbine, I have an AR platformy type gun. It just looks like an AR. Actually, I don't think a whole lot of the parts are interchangeable, but it does take Glock 17 mags and fires 9mm. And so there's all kinds of guns out there that fire that standard Glock mag. And if you're looking at two that might be remarkably similar, right? If you're looking at, there's the CZ Scorpion that's 9mm. I like that a little better than this Freedom PX9 or FX9 or something. But the FX9 fires a magazine that you already stock in triplicate, then of course, go with that one that you maybe like 10% less and just get better with it, because then you don't have to stock yet another magazine, which we all know is a failure point for firearms.
Yeah, absolutely. And this can come down to, do you have a full-size spare in the back of your car Or
Yep.
do you have the little donut?
I have two. I have a
I know
spare.
you have two. But why are you not standardizing everything
Right?
that you can? And yes, this does take, in some cases, some forethought and some resources and
Absolutely.
money to do it. But
Sure.
if something happens, you will thank yourself a million times over, because you don't have to struggle with learning a new way to do something. It's force of habit at that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I give you an example. Like if you do have vehicles with the same bolt patterns, then yeah, being able to have uh, interchangeable wheels are huge. Or if you have the option, you go to buy new tires, and obviously there's a bunch of different tire sizes you can get, right? Wider and skinnier tires. But if you have a set of snow chains at home that already fit another vehicle, and you just have to change the width of your new tire when you're buying them by a fraction of an inch to accommodate the snow chains you already own. Well, like you said, having a little forethought to do those things, you're going to be far more prepared down the road by standardizing that equipment.
And yes, and the one other thing that I want to kind of bring up here is the universal tools. So I have a problem with universal tools
Mm-hmm.
because they're not universal.
They never are.
Having something like a multi-tool, a Gerber, I mean, you can go into just about any brand, and if they make multi-tools, they likely have the version with the saw blade, they have the version with the scissors, they have the version with the tweezers, and
Sure.
none of them are the same. You end
Right.
up with that, Swiss Army knife that takes up 3/4 of your palm just to get it to go into your pocket.
Yep.
But a universal tool does not exist. So when you are going through and kind of preparing for what could happen, look at the most likely scenario, the second most likely scenario, and kind of work your way down and identify the tools that you need to get those jobs done. You may end up with 2 or 3 or maybe even 5 different tools to make an escape out of your tornado shelter if a tornado hits you. You may have to
Sure.
use your multi-tool and flashlight and things like that. But the tools that you get, if you can focus on higher quality tools to accomplish 90% of that job, they're going to last. You're not going to run into that planned obsolescence that we experience just about every day. Every time an LED light bulb that's supposed to last 30 years goes out in my house, I get a little bit more and more pissed.
Yeah.
But if you can find the tools that fit the majority of your jobs and will last that long to get those jobs done, that's a key portion to focus on. Is now you still have that adaptability while maintaining some sort of standard.
Right. No, I think that's exactly it. I think that's the take home point there is just start thinking in such a way about how is this going to affect everything else I do kind of down the road. If you can standardize one piece of equipment for a tiny bit more effort or money, that's the prepper way. That is the way to think, is that if I can spend if the only difference is a couple of dollars to buy the same brand TV of all the other TVs you already have, then just do that. Spend the extra couple of bucks, because then you're going to be standardized across those platforms. And yeah, like you said, then maybe it will actually save you money in the long run, because you're not going to have to spend the extra money to do a same day delivery on the Amazon remote on game day.
I like it. I like it. So we are actually at time,
I like it.
believe it or not. I can't believe that hour went that fast.
We
But
talked a lot.
definitely come back next week, because next week is going to be fun. We are doing these stocking stuffer items for under $10. So if you have somebody on your list that you want to get something for, but they have seemingly everything, or just don't know what to get that prepper in your family, your friends network, Come back next week because we're going to talk about stocking stuffers for under $10. But AC, anything else to close us out?
No, like you said, Chris, please, tell your friends, tell your family, share the podcast, and send us in an email with whatever you did to help us out, and we'll give you a couple of free tickets to Homesteader. So pretty please do that, and I think that's it for me.
Excellent. Well, we will see you back here next week. Until then, remember, you are your own stakeholder.